Andrew, would you say like when you're interviewing or creating a piece, I'm just asking a question now. Sorry, Dave.
No. Where you decided, Dave, you decided to interview 2 interviewers, so it's going to happen. I'd like to hear a bit about what is verbatim and documentary or found theater from each of you. What does it mean to you, and how did you get involved in it? I reflect on how much those different forms are on a spectrum, and so I will define my version of verbatim theater, which is a dramatic text that's been crafted predominantly from interviews. And in my particular practice, those are interviews that I've conducted, that have been carefully transcribed, with every I bracket numbers in my notations or in my punctuation that denote how long someone has paused for. So it's hyper detailed in its rendering. And then that dramatic text is performed by actors who are not the original speakers.
Wow, that's I love hearing that you even notate the amount of time someone's taking for a pause.
Oh, I always think that a 3 in brackets is this, which feels very different than that.
Yeah.
And what comes out the other side of the second one, which I learned early on in my interview process to trust silences, and that on the other side of a silence, there are often surprises.
Absolutely.
And so on the other side of a 7 or 8 second pause, you're in for something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I find that with interviewing as well. Well, yeah, with interviewing, that's definitely the case because we feel like we want to keep the conversation going. Yeah. So we think, oh, we should jump in here, but there's always some kind of like golden nugget there at the end of the silence, something people were just about to say. But and when starting to interview, I remember listening back to my interviews often and thinking, oh, if I could have just waited a second, like I think that person was about to say something, but because I was a little bit uncomfortable with that silence, I cut them off there.
Yeah.
So that's been interesting. Also, like with the interviewing, and audio recording, I remember at the beginning I did a lot of, oh great, yeah, like try, really verbal cues to try and keep the people right. But it's hard, and that's a big thing. And now we train people. Well, FIXT POINT does, and I did while I was still working there in like interviewing. And that's one of the big things we tell people, like to make sure that you're using nonverbal cues. And so you often see people interviewing if we're recording now when they're practicing, going like, because you're like, I'm the kind of person, and many of the actors that we work with at FIXT POINT or for the Tale of a Town are animated people that want people to feel comfortable. So you're saying like, yeah, great. But if you do that, you can't edit. And you can't edit between the takes or the cuts. So you can't put a piece together because you have something underneath. I'm mainly talking about our project, The Tale of a Town Canada, where we interview people all across Canada about their living memory. So what they can remember about their main street or downtown and how it's changed over the years. So we would ask people to tell us something from their own living memory. And often people would start, when you'd say, tell me about your main street, they'd start by telling us about like some pioneer or this very old building or the meaning of that monument there. But we would stop them and say, no, we're asking for just your memory, your story, what you can remember. What's your earliest memory of your main street or downtown? And then that kind of gets them starting to think about that and then move on from there. But when we notate it, we usually don't transcribe it. We actually developed a system of like listening and logging where we just, the artist, so one artist will interview and sometimes it's a different artist listening. They'll listen through and then what they'll do is every time they hear something that correlates to a certain theme, that we call it a hashtag list, nothing to do with Twitter, but a hashtag list of themes and subjects, national themes and subjects. Then they would write down the time code, when it starts, when it ends, hashtag with the subject and the theme, and then whether it's a quote, it's information, or a story, which is kind of what you're looking for. And then that's all in an Excel sheet, and then we can search across the country for stories about a general store across the country. Through the thousands of interviews, you can find all of those that are tagged general store or demolition, or, so we didn't often, people would say, oh, think they'd have to transcribe it, but because we didn't really use the actor repeating the text, we often put the actual audio piece into the performance and then found a way to make that performative.
Can you tell us a little more about Tale of a Town and exactly, how it was created and why?
Yeah, look, I have my badge on today.
Oh, yay!
I realized I put that on today. I thought, oh, that's appropriate. These are old shirts that people used to wear. Tale of a Town. It was created to just in Parkdale, and we had a storefront there for 10 years. And actually, one of the first people who rehearsed in our storefront was Andrew.
This is true.
Yeah. So we met quite a long time ago when Andrew was starting this kind of work, and me too. So I was reflecting on that today as we were going to be in this call together.
Yeah.
It's a long time ago. Yeah, Tale of a Town, we started in Parkdale, and it was all about, it's interesting because it's coming back now into people's consciousness, this theme of how important main streets and downtowns are for creating community and places where people can come together and shop and eat and play and hang out, as it in opposition to generic big box stores. So this was kind of my response to the creeping up of big box stores, big boring box stores on the outskirts of town, especially in my hometown, Ancaster, Ontario, and the demise of main streets across across Canada. Because I saw that as I toured around Canada on a Fringe Festival tour, that this was not just my main street in downtown where I grew up, but every main street in downtown was kind of dying. So I wanted to remind people of the incredible things that happen on main streets and downtowns. And in a way, for some of us during a certain period of time, that's where we found community. So in the end, I realized it wasn't really about the stores or the places, but about the kind of community that was created by people coming together and interacting with one another in different ways. Yeah. So that's the theme of it. And then, what we did is we ended up touring. I could go on and on. But we toured across the country after we did many pilots from 2014 to 2016. We went to every province and territory in Canada, including all the way up to Nunavut, on a ship where that docked at different spots, and we gathered stories through interviews. And then we created site-specific performances in each province and territory using those interviews with local artists. And there were many teams that also went across Ontario. And then we created a piece that kind of synthesized all those stories. And now I'm no longer at Fixed Point, which is the company that created and produced that. But now Fixed Point, even as we speak, has a training program. It's called the Empathy Squad, where they are using the methodology that we discovered through this project to train young artists in interviewing and creating art from audio.
So good. That is so cool. And I checked that out in my own hometown. I'm from Halifax, and I was like, did they go all the way up there?
Yeah.
They did.
We did. That was one of our first. We did a show at the Bus Stop Theatre, and we did it in the lobby because we made the lobby into a general store, because we saw so many general stores across the province of Nova Scotia. I think we went to 13 or 14 communities, and it was really awesome there. It was part of Magnetic North.
Yeah. That is the first theater that I ever did I was like a stage manager or an assistant stage manager way back when I was 15 at the Bus Stop Theater.
It was so amazing. I loved doing it there. It was cool. But of course, we never wanted to use any spaces like traditionally. Like that's weird that we had a theater, because usually we did the shows in storefronts or like in parks or like in different weird spots. So in that one, we didn't want to bring everyone into the black box, although like you did look into it sometimes to see kind of scenes, but we did it in, everyone sat in the lobby.
Andrew, are you usually performing in black boxes, do you find, or are you moving to site-specific performance?
We don't do a lot of site-specific. A big, I suppose, point of practice for us is relocation. Relocating voices that are traditionally marginalized into so-called mainstream spaces. I think, Lisa Marie, you've talked before about a fascination with Main Street, but also like who gets excluded by the Main Street.
Yeah.
I know that comes up in your work too. And I think as reflecting on verbatim theater and what the work Project Humanity does is being invested in who falls away from the Main Street in many ways or is disserved by the Main Street. And that's in maybe I may be blundering the metaphor there a little bit, because I know a small town Main Street is not the same as, the mainstream, so to speak. But we do work in the theater predominantly, like traditional spaces. And I think part of the interruption of our work is bringing voices that don't typically echo in those rooms, bringing those voices into those spaces. There have been notable exceptions. When we did The Middle Place, which is my first documentary play, and that was composed of interviews I did with youth shelter residents in Rexdale. We did perform that piece in its first iteration in the cafeteria of the shelter, which I would say is probably my most satisfying theatrical experience ever. In so much as the stakes could not have been higher in terms of bringing back the work as interpreted and grappled with by artists to the community of origin, and seeing what they thought, whether it spoke to them, how did it vibrate for them, had we done justice. So that would be an instance of bringing it out of the black box context. We also toured that through the TDSB and into other shelters. But usually we work with theaters and hopefully are creating ripples from within the mainstream.
So if you're taking a project like The Middle Place or something about people on the fringe, I guess, and you take that to a mainstream space, what effect does that have on the mainstream audiences who see it?
Well, it's, an audience is not one thing, and it's what's thrilling actually. I think I kept thinking about what is a key word around our aesthetic and why we do the work we do, and I'd say encounter. More than story, the notion of creating encounter is really valuable to us. And you never know who's in the midst of that encounter. When that work is being interpreted on stage, the audiences usually, our audiences are varied. And in fact, there have been incredible moments of debate and I'd say even conflict in the audience around what's happening. Notably, I'm thinking of when we were at Canadian Stage with The Middle Place. Some of our youth matinees had at-risk youth in the audience alongside, folks who've been coming to the theater for the last, 40 years. And there were moments of cohesion with that group. And then there were also moments where there was discord. And that was really exciting for us. I remember a patron during that run voiced that, in The Middle Place, these young people who are in the shelter talk about their dreams. And some of their dreams are really, familiar. They're like, I want a new iPhone. It's not always, I want a stable apartment setting or, and so I remember a patron at Canadian Stage, a longtime patron, I would imagine, saying, I think these young people need a wake-up call. They need a wake-up call. They're focusing on the wrong things. And it was a high school student that literally stood up at that point and said, all people are allowed to dream. And she was really like animated and activated around who she had seen on stage or the voices she had encountered on stage, and wanting to be their defenders, wanting to actually express the validity of their dreams, however small. And I have a lot of heart for both of those individuals in that audience, both of those vantage points. And I think that's like a key to this work, is you get a multiplicity of voice on stage if you're doing it in certain ways. You also get a multiplicity of perspective in the audience. And in that regard, I feel like this work is about nuance. It's not about binaries. It's actually about breaking down binaries and appreciating that truths are multifaceted, and we can come at a story or come at an issue or come at an idea or argument from so many different angles. And that when we populate our theater spaces with a multiplicity of voice, the upshot is we get a sort of a healthier democracy. We get a healthier take on what's happening in the world. Big star around this is the big asterisk is, it's important who is doing the work, and exposing bias and appreciating that the play that I'm writing, that I'm crafting from interview, has my middle-class, white, male, queer, Ukrainian, vegetarian vantage point that's, at the center of the art making. And so I think, a big key to this, and I don't know if we were going to talk about this, but, there are huge liabilities with this work. It's like risky work. And ethical relationship has to be the priority.
Yeah, that's like your positionality, where you're coming from in terms of interviewing, and what you're, when I say about Tale of a Town that we wanted to bring back Main Streets or talk about how amazing Main Streets were, as we went, that was what we set out to do. But as we continued the project, we realized that, as Andrew alluded to, that Main Streets weren't amazing for everybody. Not everybody was included there. And that was a big thing that we discovered along the way, that was just my perspective and my experience. So what was it really that we were after? What was that feeling? It wasn't those streets, but it was a place where people belong, and we could do better than Main Streets, actually, is what we realized. That but there was a lot of people that would have dissenting views also that we interviewed too, and it was always interesting to hear those and to try to let those things come through. People that loved going to Walmart and going to big box stores, people who couldn't shop on Main Streets because things were so expensive, and it's like a boutique shopping experience now, and so that audience together to hear different perspectives is where that kind of cohesion happens, where people can hear the voices of somebody that thinks a lot like them and somebody that might think a lot differently, but you hear the human voice of that person, or you see, in the case of kind of a verbatim piece, you see that character, that person come to life, and that creates some kind of empathy, which really is, in essence, what theater is trying to do, is trying to create a way for us to relate to one another through stories, through experience. By putting our stories on stage, we see ourselves reflected or not, and then how that changes us or motivates us. Yeah. It's interesting though, because there's always some kind of subjectivity there based on, and then when Tale of a Town grew and other people were interviewing, it was also all of their stance. Even when they listen and log, like people would say, I don't know what to pull out here. I don't know. I'm not sure what you want. What should I notate? What time codes should I capture in this? And I said, that's why this is art. This is an artistic project. These are artists. You're hired as an artist to do this work. So it's what captures you, what you think is important in this interview is what's going to end up being in the performance or on the story map or in the TV episode. Those are the things that you're going to capture. So, because if it was different, it wasn't an academic project, and it wasn't about some kind of computer analytical, pulling out this subject. It was also about the way the person said that, the tone in their voice, the quality of the recording, the space between it, all of those things made for a beautiful You know, if someone said, "Oh, I miss those days," you know, it's different than, "Oh, I miss those days." You might cut that, but you might take the other one because of how they said it too. So that kind of artistic framing on all of those things, I think, is what makes the work of documentary theater artists different than just documentary work or academic work or interviews for an academic paper, etc., because you're pulling out those kinds of things as well.
What would you say is the chief difference between the documentary theater maker and other theater makers?
I'd say that there's little difference in so much as I think a documentary play or a verbatim play is served by certain theatrical, dramatic, I would call them exigencies, like certain, things like conflict, things like rising action, things like, rhythm and, structure. I in fact think that the middle place used a 5-act Shakespearean structure. So the only thing that, made it fundamentally different was that I did not generate the dialogue. The dialogue was by virtue of encountering a community, not my own. But in terms of making a play, in terms of making it dramatically legible, in terms of taking an audience for a ride, in terms of, sort of keeping it from just being information, like actually making it active, I look to Shakespeare. I look to Tony Kushnir's structures. I look to Sarah Ruhl's structures. So I don't know. I actually think there's a dramaturge that I dearly love, who after the middle place said, like, that was really phenomenal sequencing. And I was like, sequencing? Oh, I felt so kind of diminished in that. I think I feel better about it now, actually. But it was so much more than sequencing. In my, I sort of tortured myself around how to actually take the audience. Alan Dilworth, my collaborator on that, he always says, take the audience by the hand, and you start walking first, and then you start running. And I just thought, wow, that process that every playwright has to go through around taking the audience by the hand and just going, okay, and then let's go. Whether that's a documentary play, whether that's a more traditionally crafted play, that still has to happen, I think. And I do meet a lot, particularly from academia, I do meet lots of people who do ethnographies and say, I've got these amazing interviews. I think there's a play. And a little part of me always sinks a little bit, because it's more than just good interviews. It's more than just good stories. Something else has to be in play there for it actually to transfer to a dramatic language. And for me, that's usually about metaphor. Why activate a metaphor around something? And what does theatrical metaphor provide interview text? I'd like to include this story, and this is why. This is how it would, sort of fit in the constellation of ideas in this part of the play. Do you remain okay with me using this story in the piece? I think all that relational work, again, people think that verbatim plays are quicker and easier to write because you didn't have to come up with the words. I would say the ethical relationship piece, quadruples, it exponentially increases the amount of labor. And it ought to, if that's the privilege.